The topic of today's lecture is the ancient foundations of psychology, the foundations laid in the ancient Greek world, and I think it's proper to begin with an explanation of why it is we always begin with the ancient Greek world. If one were providing the foundations for biology, political science, philosophy, logic, any of the academic subjects, including mathematics, chances are that the speaker, the teacher, would be beginning at pretty much the same point I'm beginning. And of course, particularly in our current age of refined and to some extent elevated sensitivities on these matters, it really does become necessary to explain why we're always beginning in the ancient Greek world. Sometimes it seems as if scholars believe nothing existed before Socrates and Plato and that crowd, that there never was an Orient, there never was an Egypt or a Phoenicia or Babylonia or Samaria and the like. Well, the ancient Greek culture is itself indebted to earlier civilizations, Mycenaean and Egyptian, African, Northern African, and the like. Many controversial claims have been made about the nature of that debt. I think some of the claims are entirely exaggerated and, in fact, will simply not stand up under the weight of evidence. If the question is the ancient Greek debt to Egypt, for example, there's quite a definite debt in monumental architecture. There's good evidence that the ancient Greek world, by way of its contacts with Egypt, came to recognize the monumental functions that could be served by architecture. It is said, by the way, that when the Greeks first spotted the pyramids, it reminded them of a little triangular cake that they used to make, a little honey cake, which had the same shape. And the story may be apocryphal, but it is said that when the Greeks came upon the pyramids, they pointed with a sort of chuckle and said, pyramidoi. They're like these little honey cakes because they have that shape. And the answer to the question, what shape, is pyramid-shaped. By the way, in case you're wondering where the current expression comes from, he takes the cake. Well, these little cakes were often given to winners in some of the Olympic contests, the fast running and the like. The winner would come up and the reward would be a cake, and that means that the fast runner took the cake. Well, let me say a few words about why we do begin with the ancient Greek world. Setting aside for the question, for the moment, the question of what debts the ancient Greek world had to older cultures. With ancient Greece, we get the first evidence of a thoroughly self-critical perspective on one's own basic knowledge claims. We find in the ancient Greek world and in the ancient Greek world of thought the first evidence of a people actually recognizing their deepest convictions, their deepest sentiments, as subjects for critical appraisal and study. The famous inscription at the temple at Delphi, the temple dedicated to Apollo, Nothe Seauton, know thyself, is rich in meaning, rich and subtle in meaning. It doesn't refer to some sort of cross-legged lotus position, introspective, who am I, existential sort of crisis sort of thing. No. Know the sort of being you are. Understand the kind of life that's right for you. Understand the relationship in which you stand to other beings and to the world and to the cosmos. So this is the fruitful foundational period for what we take to be the academic and scholarly subjects. The greatest debt ancient Greek thought has to all sources is the debt it has to Homer, the blind poet, whose name, by the way, actually means hostage. Who was Homer? Who was she? Who was he? How many might there have been? Is the one who sung Iliad the same one who later sung Odyssey? These are the great Homer questions, and it's not within the purposes of this course even to address those. That there was an epic poetry tradition even before Homer, and one on which Homer relied, there is no doubt. Homer himself probably composed a version of what we now have as Iliad, circa 750 BC. An earlier dating might be 800 BC. The importance of Iliad particularly, but together Iliad and Odyssey, is that these were epic poems that conditioned the ancient Greek mind to think about certain issues and to think about them in certain ways. In fact, if you consult the dialogues of Plato and go down the index of names to see who the most frequently cited people are in these dialogues, the most frequently cited person in the dialogues is Homer. It'll be a passage from Homer. It'll be some image that Homer presents. The epics themselves are extraordinary works. They still read well. It still repays the effort of the modern citizen to go through these works in almost any translation. And I should tell you that the work itself begins, the very first work in Iliad begins with the word anger. Noble anger. Menin, minas, noble anger. This is an epic about anger. More generally, it's an epic poem about how our emotions, flying in the face of the counsel of good reason and prudence, can find us immersed in what is nothing less than a tragedy. It's a kind of ancient version, a pre-classical version of what in the 17th century would have been called an emblem book, something like Pilgrim's Progress. And so when the Greek world would recite passages from Homer over the evening fire, it was with the intention of raising their children in a certain way to attach them to certain values and understandings. Homer's epics are the background condition for much that will come to be the formal philosophical and psychological thought of the classical world. Homer himself attempts to explain the conduct of the major participants in the Trojan War. Why Diomedes in a fit will actually turn on nothing less than a goddess, strike out. What carries one forth? Why it is that Achilles finally puts his noble anger aside and joins the fray after his dear friend, his closest friend, Patroclus, has been killed in battle. And so in every stanza, we find some reference to motivation, to what it is that's moving one. There's always the recognition that behind the screen, the gods are working their will through these human affairs. They may have contempt for us. They may have love for us. They may simply be curious about us. They might have interests in us that border on the prurient. They will occasionally mate with one of us. But nonetheless, they are immortal. They cannot die. It's not blood that runs through their bodies, but ichor. And the life they live for the sheer pleasure of it. They are not burdened by human cares and human woes. We must propitiate the gods so that they will not take out after us. They might even show us favor. But know this about the gods. None of them is omniscient. None of them knows the future for certain. They very often are vying with each other. And so we have, even in the pre-classical religion of the Greek-speaking people, sufficient flexibility so that there is no divine scriptural body, textual body, traditional body that can be consulted to answer questions once and for all. There's a very, very happy blending of this rather open-textured theology and what might be called the philosophical frame of mind. Ask Pharaoh the meaning of something or the nature of something, and Pharaoh answers you once and for all. Well, that tends to be a debate stopper. There are no once and for all answers in Homer, or in fact in the whole of Olympian divinities. This is an important factor. When Homer does seek to explain why people are doing what they're doing, he offers psychological explanations. He says, well, the certain part of the chest has been overcome by something. The person has been occupied with a kind of furor. It might be minos. It might be a noble anger. It might be lusa, which is the wolf's rage. And if you are overcome by the wolf's rage, nothing can control you. At this point, you are quite literally possessed. Lord only knows what you're going to do next. You will turn in feats that are almost divine in their dimensions. And in fact, you are being used, as it were. A part of your very nature has been taken over by something actually physical. What I want to say in this connection is that much of the Homeric psychology is of a quite mechanistic, biological, naturalistic nature. And this must be because the poet himself is recognizing in himself the signs of anger, love, joy, disappointment, pleasure, confusion. And since these states carry with them certain physiological feelings, kinesthetic feelings, senses within the body, the pit of the stomach, that sort of thing, something welling up in the chest, being heartbroken. Well, he turns to the body as the place where these influences take place and in fact allow one to explain the behavior itself. So whether it's a matter of compassion or the wolf's rage or noble fury, whether it's psyche, or psyche, as the ancient Greeks would have said, whether it's psyche being visited by one of Zeus's dream demons, so that in fact you wake up in the morning with a resolve you never thought you would have, because Zeus is playing on your dream states as one might play on a concertina. This all is found in Homer. It's a background consideration for what later will be a quite systematic, philosophical, and even scientific inquiry into the nature of life and mind. Now, that formal inquiry, that inquiry into human nature, its very nature, and what is implied by that nature, begins in earnest with Socrates. Now, Socrates is not the first philosopher. There is a rich pre-Socratic tradition, but that pre-Socratic tradition finds speculation concerned chiefly with the cosmos. Not solely, but chiefly. With Socrates, attention turns to human concerns. His approach is, his interest is anthropocentric. He's concerned about the human condition, about the kind of life that's right for human beings, about the relationship between the individual and the state, about the sources of our ignorances and confusions, about what constitutes a virtuous and decent life. And these come down to us through the dialogues of Plato, which are very much like theater pieces. Some of them are quite funny. Some of them are extremely perplexing. Some of them, to this day, would work very well as theater pieces. In fact, sometimes the dialogue symposium is actually staged dramatically with after-dinner libations and then an inquiry into the nature of love, etc., etc. Now, with Plato, and whether it's Plato or Socrates, there's a Socratic Socrates and a Platonic Socrates, and it's very, very difficult to tease out the two. In one of Plato's epistles, an epistle attributed to Plato, which we think is authentic, he says, "Nothing you find in these dialogues is the work of Plato. I just wrote this stuff down, do you see? Anything in here that's original and worth your attention is to be attributed to Socrates." To which I would reply, not a bit of it. This is not just a chap who is sitting there taking notes. These are one of the extraordinary literary and philosophical achievements of the human imagination. And if one wants to know to whom the credit belongs, the answer is Plato, which is something of a nickname. Platon, very, very broad-shouldered, and so he came to be known as Platon. Now, the Socratic philosophy is indebted, I say, to pre-Socratic sources, and surely one of the debts is to the great and famous and elusive and mysterious Pythagoras. It was Pythagoras and his sect that reached the more or less settled position that ultimate truth expresses itself in number. That is, mere appearance is a source of deception. Whatever appears to us through our perceptual and sensory apparatus must be fleeting, material, transitory, ultimately degradable, ultimately decomposable into mere dust and rubbish. The eternal truths are found relationally, in the form of harmonic relationships, rational order, numerical order, and number. It is said that the Pythagorean teaching thought that all of reality springs from the first four positive integers, because 1 is the numerical source of a point, 2 constitutes the possibility of a line, 3 constitutes the possibility of a plane, 4 constitutes the possibility of a solid, and out of these 4 primary integers, it's possible on the Pythagorean account for what they call the cosmic soul to generate all of physical reality. It's also Pythagoras, we are told, who worked out the original theory of harmony in music and the harmonic scales. Now, not because Pythagoras himself was an avid banjo player or sitar player. No, here again was evidence that the human soul is tuned in a certain way. It's tuned to match up with precise mathematical relationships. And music that is written, composed, and played according to these pure mathematical relationships will be heard as harmonic. The reason it sounds right is because the harmonies of the rational soul and the acoustic harmonies achieved by the right kind of music enjoy a hand-in-glove relationship. Now, I say this is a background consideration, and what it encourages the Socratics to believe then, or at least what it encourages them to argue for, is the view that the kind of truth philosophers should search for is not to be found in the flotsam and jetsam of the material world, the transitory world of things, things that can become degraded, things that change even as you look at them, things that give rise to illusions and preposterous beliefs and mere opinion. No, what the philosopher should seek, the one who really is a friend of wisdom, the one who is a philos of Sophia, do you see? The philosophos, this friend of the right kind of truth, the right wisdom. That person looks for is what is immutable, what is eternal, what never changes, what is not only true once and here, but true always and everywhere. And that, of course, can't be anything material, because what is material undergoes degradation and change, the eternally true doesn't. And so we find in many of the Socratic dialogues a certain skepticism about the evidence of sense and the role of perception. When Socrates is asked on one occasion whether he agrees with Protagoras that man is the measure of all things, you know, that each person, by way of his own standards, his own experiences and perceptions, constitutes the ultimate measure for him of whatever is true, Socrates says, well, why didn't he say the dog-faced baboon is the measure of all things? Because the dog-faced baboon has more acute vision than we do. And he says further, if each person is the measure of all things, why is everybody lined up listening to Protagoras over there and paying good money for the experience instead of just sitting around with chums and divining these things for himself? So Socrates is arguing that no, the knowledge is not relative here. It's not relative to time, place, and culture. Certain facts might be, opinions surely are, but the business of philosophy is to find that which transcends culture, transcends time. Now the question is, can we ever know such a thing? And if we can know it, how do we know it? One of the dialogues that takes this on quite directly is the dialogue named after one of the chief participants in it, in this case, Minos. Meno. And Meno is a wealthy young Athenian, back in town now. He's been out of town for a while. He's attended by a young servant, and he and Socrates engage in a kind of conversation. You know, hello, Socrates, how are you? Well, I'm fine. And what are you up to? Well, you know, same old stuff, search for truth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at this point, Meno pretty much thinks he has Socrates exactly where he wants him. Search for truth. Well, Socrates, don't you realize that if you know what it is you're searching for, there's no need to undertake a search? And if you don't know what it is you're searching for, there's no basis upon which to undertake a search. And Meno here is quite satisfied that he's got the old boy, and that's the end of it. Socrates says, this youngster with you, who is he? Oh, Meno says after that, he's a slave, he's a barbarian, you know. Of course, the ancient Greek meant by a barbarian is anybody who wasn't speaking Greek. Anything that wasn't Greek sounded to them as if it were kind of ba, 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 and so you were a barbarian if you were not speaking Greek. Well, Socrates wants to know whether this youngster has had any education. The answer is no. And with that, Socrates begins to ask the boy a series of yes-no type questions, drawing some things in the sand. And what he shows to his own satisfaction is that the boy comes to recognize that the area of a square is uniquely determined by the length of a diagonal drawn through it, which is to say the boy knows the Pythagorean theorem. Yet he never learned it in school, and Socrates didn't give him the answer. So where did he have the answer? Where did he get the answer? And Socrates replies to that question by saying, look, he always had it. It is a truth available to the soul in virtue of its having rational power. It takes philosophical guidance to lead the soul to its own understandings, but they are there. Make no mistake about it. The reason you can't find these truths easily is because you're saddled by perception. You're wrapped up in a world of material things, and thus you cannot reach the transcendent truths to which the soul otherwise has access. So here we get a Platonic psychology that is skeptical about the senses, skeptical about merely perceptual knowledge, and that defends a much more rationalistic approach to knowledge and understanding, an approach based on what are taken to be immutable principles, ultimately taking the form of universal or true forms. The rectilinear triangle you draw on a pad is never going to be perfect. It will change with time. It will wither and go the way of all things fleshy and physical. But a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the Pythagorean theorem itself, undergoes no change. So here we have the true form of that which, when drawn, is just a quite corrupted version. Now, what this gives us, then, is a philosophical psychology. At once, if it's skeptical about perception and sensation, then of course it must also be skeptical about experience itself. What is experience except an accumulation of perceptions? So in fact, wisdom is not going to come simply from having lots of experiences, and wisdom is not going to come even from the voiced, shared experiences of the many. That is, if it's a nation of fools, finding out what 51% of them want isn't very helpful. So you can't count on majorities, you can't count on the enumeration of opinions as these show up. What you're looking for is the person who actually gets it right, the one who does understand what the nature of the human condition is and what's right for it. What you need then is a philosopher king. You need someone who by nature and as a result of philosophical guidance has attained a degree of wisdom otherwise unavailable to the masses. So this is also an elitist, a politically elitist philosophy, and in fact, it is what is sometimes referred to as a highly nativistic philosophy, in that it distinguishes between and among persons on the basis of a native endowment. In Plato's Republic, he cites the old myth of Hesiod, or the example served up by Hesiod, of men of gold, men of silver, men of brass, and men of iron. And there's no pattern of experiences that will make a man of iron a man of gold. You've got to start off with the right quality of being, and then through the right kind of education and training, you get the worthiest of citizens. Now, that's a very, very brief sketch of an extremely deep and vexing systematic philosophy which did undergo changes over time. There is a fellow who actually was exposed to this teaching for all of 20 years, and he didn't spend 20 years studying in the academy because he was a slow learner. He took all this in, he learned it and mastered it thoroughly, and then systematically moved away from it. And the young fellow I have in mind is a chap you may have heard of by the name of Aristotle. Yes, he studied within Plato's academy for 20 years. He left town. When Plato died, the directorship of the academy did not go to Aristotle. He did leave town. He got married. He studied the cuttlefish off the shores of the Aegean. He spent some time teaching Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great was a youth. He comes back into Athens and founds his own school, the Lyceum, which, by the way, in 1997, the Greek authorities claim to have uncovered. It's many, many layers down over what recently has been a parking lot, which tells us about the nature of things. Aristotle's approach is quite different from the Platonic approach. Aristotle's approach is one that I think many of us would feel quite at home with today. It's quite naturalistic, very heavily based on observation. The answer to the question, what is the nature of psychology, is, well, that depends. It varies in different animals. The answer to the question, what is the soul, is not some transcendental entity sitting above the head and shaped like an ellipse or a little wafer. The soul, he says, by soul, by psyche, I refer to the archezoon. I simply refer to the first principle of living things. I refer to that in virtue of which a thing that is alive actually lives. So what he has in mind is a constellation of processes that are life-giving processes. And he recognizes that living things vary in their complexity, which means that a psychic process sufficient to account for everything found in a very, very simple animal will be quite different from the psychic processes needed to account for example, complex organisms, the elephant that learns to kneel in the presence of a king, or indeed the king who learns how to give good laws. But Aristotle still wants to tie even these complexities to very basic processes. Many of them he marks out as basic biological processes. Much of what we know is based on perception. He begins one of his most seminal works, the Metaphysics, one of the most profound works in all of philosophy. He begins it with this sentence: all men by nature desire to know. An example of that, listen carefully, an example of that is the delight we take in our senses. For even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and of all of them, none so much as vision. Now here in just a few sentences, he says the agenda has changed. We're not skeptical about the senses. The entire animal economy negotiates the world by way of its senses. So do we when we're trying to find our way home, or read a papyrus, or make sure the souffle doesn't fall. So the perceptions count for much. But there's more than perception. There's also, with human beings, a rational power that allows us to frame universal propositions and come to understand things that would not be available to non-human beings. Now, coupled with this is the Hippocratic school of ancient Greek medicine, which is very observational, very experimental in its approach, very much avoiding rational, deductive approaches to disease and treatment, instead relying on observable facts systematically gleaned by the experienced clinician. We do see this very definite, naturalistic, biological, scientific approach to matters psychological and mental. I might mention that the famous Hippocratic Oath, which all the doctors take, may well have been a Pythagorean document. And the reason for that is that that oath calls for two things, quite at variance with the standard practices in ancient Greek medicine. First, that you do not let out the secrets of the medical craft. You keep them within the family, so to speak. And secondly, that you not administer a pessary for a woman to abort a fetus. Now abortifacients were common in ancient Greek medicine, and in fact medical schools existed. But the one school of medicine, or sect of medicine, that would have had those two provisions in place would have been the Pythagorean. So if you want to say that doctors may not know it, but they're taking a Pythagorean oath when they think they're taking a Hippocratic one, I think you'll have some texts to rely on. What we get in the ancient Greek world is the possibility of a highly rational, abstract, transcendent approach to the understanding of human psychology, that patterned very much on the lines developed by Plato, and a quite naturalistic, even biological and systematic scientific approach very much on the order of what was developed by Aristotle in his classical studies of the animal kingdom, animal anatomy, and the relationship between biological processes and psychological functions. So the foundations are laid. We can say that ancient Greek philosophy put in place a set of questions, ultimately focusing on the challenge and the task of knowing oneself, and giving us a wide range of options from the transcendent, philosophical, mathematical and abstract, to the very, very gritty, Hippocratic, medical, biological, and experimental. And over a course of centuries, both of those influences would find full and rich expression in the activities of those we now judge to be the founders and leaders of psychology.